understand the Federalist Papers, the first thing that I want to do is paint a picture of the political landscape at the time in 1787, just to give you a general idea of what was going on. If you don't already know, of course, the Constitution was written and signed, but there was a lot of other stuff going on. Federalist Paper 1 is not part of the series of Federalist Papers, but it's more an introduction to the fact that there is going to be more Federalist Papers and what they are going to cover. It's more of a statement, really. So I'm going to use this time to kind of paint this picture for you of what was going on at the time, so that you can understand what the Federalist Papers' purpose was and what the outcome of having the Federalist Papers was. I want to just start by saying that there was a lot of political upheaval at the time. The United States was under the rule of law that already existed, was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation gave powers to the states mainly, with a very weak centralized government that didn't have what we have with the Constitution and the separation of powers. It lacked a lot of power, and so the states really grew very independent. Some of them had their own currency. There was issues, a lot of issues. Most of the states were in debt because of the Revolutionary War. And the states, I believe, were probably feeling some pressure. At least some of the states were feeling a lot of pressure that they could easily be overtaken again, either by another state or by, if England decided to come back and attack again. There was a lot of challenges that some of the states had, and they really couldn't look to the central government for help of any kind, financially, militarily, if they needed it, and they were somewhat isolated in that sense. The framers of the Constitution, our founding fathers, noticed, and they wanted to come up with a solution that would keep the Union together, to keep the 13 states together, seeing that they would soon probably split up into either factions, or some states would become more powerful perhaps, and take over other states. I mean, anything really could happen, and the different laws and the different rules in states was starting to become very apparent. And the kind of the pinnacle of what happened was that in Massachusetts there was a group of farmers. I'm sure you guys learned about this in school, and they were unable to basically farm because they were broke. They owed taxes. Their land was going to be taken away, and they rose up against their local state government, and they were able to overcome the state government. Of course, under the Articles of Confederation, the weak central government, the weak federal government, if you will, at the time, was unable to really stop them, and it took a private militia, some people that wanted to kind of gain back the sovereignty of their state again. It took that to bring down the rebellion that was occurring. That was just a year, not even a year, before our founding fathers decided to get together in Philadelphia and draft a new constitution that would make up for the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Now, that sounds all fine and dandy, like, okay, here's the solution. We're going to draft a new document, which they did, and it was very carefully drafted to give a representative style of government to the republic in order to keep the Union together, they knew that this was paramount for the Union to survive, that they really needed to do this in a way that would subvert any possible tyranny of a centralized government again. And so the states, some of the states saw the benefit of this and they were on board immediately. Other states wanted to maintain their independence, their sovereignty, their own currency, and they did not want to give up anything to a centralized government. They were very fearful of what might happen. And so there was some polarization there, at not unsimilar to the polarization that we have now. And so dealing with the opposition at the time was going to be a little more difficult. So what they had to do after they drafted this Constitution, I'm sure what you remember from the Constitution is they all got together in Philadelphia, they drafted the Constitution, they signed it, and that was that, and that's the rule of law, and that's what we have now is the Constitution. But it didn't really happen quite like that. The first Constitution that they drafted was called the Draft Constitution. It wasn't agreed upon by everybody, and it was not the rule of law, and it wasn't the law of the land for a couple of years to come after that, because under the Articles of Confederation, there would need to be 2/3 of the states would need to agree in order to ratify the Constitution, and that took about 2.5 years to happen. And during that time, there was a lot of political upheaval that occurred. And, thank you to Alexander Hamilton, who decided that shortly after, when I say shortly after, literally weeks after, in the weeks following the signing of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton decided that he was going to try and put out the information about what this Constitution is and what its purpose was and how it was going to ensure that Americans kept their liberties and their freedoms. This wasn't going to be an easy task, because when you look at the communications of the day, people got their information from newspapers and word of mouth, and politicians that may have traveled and speaking to people directly. At the time, there was, I think, about 4 million citizens total among the 13 states, which is a lot of people. And there's a lot of rumors out there about the Constitution and central government trying to take over, your life and trying to take over your state. And, there's a lot of opposition to the Constitution and even the idea of a Constitution. In order to combat the opposition, Alexander Hamilton decided that he was going to pen and publish a series of essays, a series of papers, and really what they were is they were articles. So he was going to pen a series of articles that explained the Constitution in detail, that in publications of the time that just about everybody read. And especially at a time of political upheaval, rebellion, and all types of things going on, people were very, very political at the time, almost everybody, just as we are now. And just as we are now, they also were very polarized. You were either on one side or the other. Okay, you either did not want this Constitution or you did. And this was going to probably end in war. And Alexander Hamilton realized this, and he decided that because he understood how important keeping the Union together was, that he was going to explain every single aspect, every single article of the Constitution, and all of the things that those articles implied, and all of the ways that the Constitution protected people's liberty, people's freedom, and not only that, but where those freedoms came from, that the how the balance of power and the separation of powers and how it was designed. He knew that none of this information was going to get to the people unless they read the Constitution, and that wasn't going to happen. People are going to get their information just like we get it now. You get stories, you get fake news, you get rumors and everything else. That was going on then as well. So he understood the importance of getting this information out there, and he knew how to get it out there, and he got it out in the form of the Federalist Papers, what they call the Federalist Papers now. The reason for that is they were penned and just called the Federalist. The opposition to the Constitution was the anti-federalists. That's what they called themselves. The loyalists called themselves the anti-federalists. And so penning something called the Federalist Papers and the Federalist Essays, it was something that, everybody was going to read. They wanted to know, okay, just what is this all about, kind of thing. And the end result was that explaining what the Constitution was really about, and explaining the protection of liberties, and explaining where our rights come from according to this document, that it is, based in Christianity, and that it's based in, liberty and freedom, and to get that out to the masses, to 4 million people across 13 states, was critical. And it did actually turn the tide of support from opposition to acceptance. It wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. There was a lot of things that had to happen in a lot of different states. It was complicated, but 2.5 years later, the Constitution was ratified finally by the ninth state of the 13, and so we have the Constitution now. This is something that is very, very important to understand, because without the Federalist Papers being published, the Constitution likely would never have been ratified. There was 4 states that jumped on board immediately and understood, that the Union was paramount. There was a lot of states that didn't, and there was other states that had gone on to have pretty good success financially. However, on the world stage, the United States was a little bit of a liability at the time, because the central government lacked the ability to collect taxes from states. And they also lacked the ability to protect the states. And so the states were tasked with the responsibility of having their own militia. And so we were a little bit of a liability, kind of, easy takeover. If somebody really wanted to come and take over the United States, they really would only need to come and maybe conquer a state or two to kind of get, to get a divot in the ground that they could get their foothold in. But so on the world stage, the United States was the short kid on the block, so to speak. And getting the Constitution ratified was something that was going to put the United States back in power again as, a player on the world stage that could, trade and do commerce and protect itself and offer help when needed. And as we grew, that in fact did happen. Without the explanation of what the Constitution is, which is the Federalist Papers. That's what they did. There was no other source of information out there that would explain the purpose of the Constitution. That was it. And so literally the Federalist Papers are the reason that we are under the rule of the Constitution now. the work that went into explaining this to the people in a way that could be understood was this was a great undertaking. This was hero stuff. Alexander Hamilton wasn't alone. It was his brainchild, but he also he went to several delegates that were involved in the signing of the Constitution and said, this is really what we need to do. And most of them said, we don't need to do that. And a couple of them decided that this was a good idea. John Jay and James Madison also wrote several of them, and they kind of break up into a few different sections, and we're going to go over those Federalist Papers. We're going to go over what those sections are. Federalist Paper 1 is really just like I said earlier, it's an introduction to the fact that there's going to be Federalist Papers at all. And he kind of wanted to get that out there to say, here's what we're going to do. Something else to understand is that the political landscape at the time, like I said, was polarized just like it is now, except to do something this radical would probably end up in death for these guys. To really tell the opposition who you were back in 1787, 1788, to let them know who you were would be a death sentence. So when they drafted these Federalist Papers, they did it under a pseudonym, and they did it privately and submitted their documents so that in a way that people in the opposition specifically would not know who they were. And the people could take the information and they could verify it if they wanted to by looking at the Constitution, looking at a copy of the Constitution, and comparing that against the specific Federalist paper and article, and kind of putting two and two together. They were smart people. They can do that just like we can do it now. We can research stuff and find out if it's fake news or not. And so basically, they did this under a pseudonym of Philo Publius, and this was Publius was, and I don't want to get too far into a history lesson here, but Publius was the Roman activist in about 500 BC, and what he did was he brought down the Roman monarchy and started a republic there in Rome, and kind of started the same type of government, maybe not exactly the same, but the same type of representative government that Alexander Hamilton and the guys wanted for the United States. So like I said, I'm not going to get too far into a history lesson here. The importance of the Federalist Papers is one that I want to make sure gets revived. I want to revive this knowledge for people that have never even heard of the Federalist Papers, and help people understand what it was that really got our Constitution ratified. So thanks for joining me. We'll be moving on to the other Federalist Papers here in the coming weeks. There's several of them, and we're going to be going over some of them in groups. We're going to be going over some of them individually, and we're going to be talking about the importance of the Federalist Papers and just how our Constitution that we live under today was ratified by the people. Thanks for joining me.